Have you ever noticed that the most painful emptiness arrives when you finally have everything you thought you needed? The room is quiet. The obligations are met. The phone is silent. And yet, something feels hollow. Not sadness exactly. Not anxiety in the usual sense. Just a quiet void where meaning should be. Tonight, we're going to understand why that happens. And more importantly, how to recognize what your mind is actually searching for when it whispers that nothing matters. Because what you're feeling isn't failure. It's not weakness. It's one of the most profound questions a human being can encounter. Picture this. A person sits at the edge of their bed late at night. They've checked every box. Good job, loving family, comfortable home. They should feel grateful. They should feel satisfied. Instead, they feel like they're waiting for something that never arrives. The days blur together. Each one feels like a repetition of the last. They go through the motions with competence, even excellence. But underneath, a quiet voice keeps asking, is this all there is? This isn't depression in the clinical sense. It's something older, something that predates modern psychology, something that philosophers have been naming for thousands of years. The Greeks called it acedia. Medieval monks called it the noonday demon. Existentialists called it the absurd. But in the mid-20th century, a psychiatrist named Viktor Frankl gave it a new name. He called it existential vacuum. And he didn't just name it, he survived it. He studied it. He learned how to guide people through it. Not by filling the void with pleasure, not by distracting from the question, but by understanding what the void is actually asking for. Frankl discovered something most people overlook. The emptiness you feel at night isn't a sign that something is wrong with you. It's a sign that something is right with you. It means you're capable of asking deeper questions than, am I comfortable? Or am I safe? You're asking, am I living a life that matters? And that question changes everything. But here's the part most people overlook. Quietly. The search for meaning isn't the same as the search for happiness. In fact, they often move in opposite directions. The more you chase happiness, the more it slips away. But the more you move toward meaning, the more resilience, peace, and even joy arrive as byproducts. Frankl learned this in the most extreme circumstances imaginable, in places where happiness was impossible, where comfort was a distant memory, where every reason for hope had been stripped away. And yet, he watched some people collapse into despair, while others found a strength that defied explanation. The difference wasn't optimism. It wasn't personality. It wasn't even faith in the traditional sense. It was something more fundamental, something he would later call the will to meaning. Take a slow breath. Let your shoulders drop. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. You don't have to solve this tonight. You just have to listen. Because what Frankl understood is that the emptiness you feel isn't a problem to fix. It's an invitation, a call, a reminder that you're built for something more than comfort. And over the next 90 minutes, We're going to trace that invitation back to its source. We're going to understand why modern life makes it so easy to lose meaning, why pleasure fails to satisfy, why happiness can't be chased, and most importantly, what your mind is actually searching for when everything feels hollow. We're going to look at suffering, not to romanticize it, but to understand its role in human dignity. We're going to look at love, not as a feeling, but as a form of ultimate meaning. And we're going to look at freedom not as the absence of constraints, but as the presence of choice. By the end, you'll understand why emptiness isn't the opposite of meaning. It's often the doorway, and that changes everything. So let's begin with the feeling itself, the one you know but rarely name, the one that visits late at night when the distractions fade and the mind has nowhere left to run. The feeling of inner void. Chapter 2. The feeling of inner void. There's a moment that happens to almost everyone at some point. Usually late at night. Usually when you're alone. The tasks are done. The noise has stopped. And suddenly there's nothing between you and yourself. And in that space, you feel nothing. Not grief, not anger, not even worry. Just a quiet, echoless emptiness. Your mind searches for something to hold on to. A memory, a plan, a reason to feel engaged. But everything feels distant, flat, like you're watching your own life through glass. Psychologists call this depersonalization. Philosophers call it alienation. Frankl called it Sunday neurosis, the strange despair that arrives when obligations lift and free time should bring joy, but instead brings hollowness. You've felt it. Most people have. But very few people know what to do with it. Because the feeling doesn't come with instructions. It doesn't announce itself as depression or anxiety. It just sits there, quiet, persistent, unyielding. And the more you try to ignore it, the louder it becomes. Here's the part most people overlook quietly. The void isn't punishing you. It's asking you a question. But it's a question most people were never taught to hear. Let me show you what I mean. Imagine someone, let's call her Maya. She's 34. She works in marketing. She's good at her job. She has friends. She has hobbies. On paper, her life looks full. But every night, when she lies down, the same feeling returns. A sense that none of it matters. That she could be doing anything and it would feel just as hollow. At first, she thinks she's burned out. So she takes a vacation. She goes somewhere beautiful. She disconnects from work. And for a few days, it helps. The beauty distracts her. The novelty fills the space. But on the last night of the trip, sitting on a balcony overlooking the ocean, the feeling returns. She's watching the sunset. She knows it's beautiful. She knows she should feel something. But instead, she just feels empty. And that's when the real question arrives. Not, what's wrong with me? But, what am I living for? And she realizes she doesn't know. She has goals. She has plans. But none of them feel meaningful. They're just things to do, boxes to check, ways to fill time until the next thing. And underneath it all, a quiet voice keeps whispering, "Is this it? Is this all there is?" Now notice what happens when we look closer. Maya's problem isn't that she lacks pleasure. She has plenty of moments of enjoyment, good food, good company, beautiful experiences. Her problem isn't that she lacks security. She has stability, comfort, safety. Her problem is that she lacks a reason, a why, a sense that her life is pointing towards something beyond her own temporary comfort. And without that, everything feels hollow. This is the existential vacuum, and it's one of the most common psychological experiences of modern life. Frankl observed this pattern over and over. People would come to him with symptoms that looked like depression, or anxiety, or psychosomatic illness. But when he dug deeper, the real problem wasn't chemical. It wasn't even circumstantial. It was philosophical. They had lost, or never found, a sense of meaning. And here's the critical insight that changes everything. The mind repeats what the heart hasn't been allowed to finish. That emptiness you feel, it's not a defect. It's not a sign that you're broken or ungrateful or weak. It's a signal, a reminder, a call from the deepest part of yourself saying, "You were built for more than this." Let your breathing slow. Just for a moment, feel the air moving in and out. You don't have to solve this right now. You just have to notice it. Because once you see the void clearly, not as an enemy but as a question, everything shifts. Frankl used to say that the void is like a compass. It only activates when you're pointed in the wrong direction. When you're living in a way that contradicts your deeper need for meaning. The feeling isn't the problem. The feeling is the wisdom. And that's where we turn next. To the world that created this void. The systems and stories that make it so easy to lose sight of meaning. The modern life that promises fulfillment, but delivers only emptiness. Because understanding where the void comes from is the first step toward filling it with something real. Chapter 3. Modern Life and Meaning Loss. There's a reason this feeling has become epidemic. 50 years ago, people suffered. They struggled. But they rarely felt empty in the way so many people feel empty now. Something has changed. Not in human nature, but in the structure of modern life. And Frankl saw this coming, decades before smartphones, decades before the attention economy, decades before algorithmic feeds and endless scroll. He warned that as societies became wealthier and more comfortable, they would face a new kind of suffering, not the suffering of lack, but the suffering of abundance without direction, the suffering of having everything and feeling nothing. Let me show you what happened. For most of human history, meaning was inherited. You were born into a story, a religion, a community, a role, and that story told you who you were and what you were for. The farmer knew his purpose. The mother knew hers. The priest knew his. Not because they were happier, not because life was easier, but because their lives were woven into something larger than themselves. They belonged to a narrative. But then, gradually, those narratives began to dissolve. Religion declined. Communities fragmented, roles became fluid, traditions became optional, and in their place, individual choice, which sounds like freedom. And in many ways, it is. But freedom without direction is just drift. Now, instead of inheriting meaning, you're expected to create it, invent it, find it, as if meaning was something you could purchase or download or stumble across. And when you can't, you feel like you've failed. But here's the quieter truth beneath that. You haven't failed. The system has. Modern life is built on a set of promises that can't be kept. It promises that success will bring fulfillment, but then you succeed and still feel empty. It promises that pleasure will bring happiness, but then you have pleasure and still feel restless. It promises that freedom will bring peace, but then you have freedom and still feel lost. The promises aren't lies exactly. They're just incomplete, because what they're really selling you is relief, not meaning, and relief and meaning are not the same thing. This is where the pattern reveals itself. Think about the modern workday. You wake up, you check your phone, you scroll through carefully curated images of other people's lives, you feel a pang of inadequacy, you go to work, you perform tasks, you meet metrics, you chase outcomes that feel vaguely important but somehow disconnected from anything you deeply care about. You come home, you're tired, so you scroll some more. You watch something. You numb the restlessness with entertainment or food or distraction, and then you lie down, and the emptiness returns, because none of it pointed anywhere. None of it asked, "What are you living for?" Frankl called this the existential vacuum, and he watched it spread like a contagion through modern societies. Not because people became lazier, not because they became weaker, but because the world stopped offering them anything worth living for beyond their own temporary comfort. And comfort, by itself, is not enough. Here's the part that most people overlook. Quietly. The void isn't created by tragedy, it's created by meaninglessness. You can endure almost anything if you have a reason, but you can't endure comfort if it feels pointless. Frankl proved this in the most extreme way imaginable. In the concentration camps, where every external reason for hope was stripped away, he watched people survive or collapse based on one thing: whether they still had a reason to live. Not happiness, not comfort, not even survival for its own sake, but meaning. A man who knew his wife was waiting for him, a scientist who had unfinished work, a father who believed his children needed him. These weren't delusions, these weren't distractions, these were threads of meaning that kept the person tethered to life when every other reason had been burned away. And in the modern world, we have the opposite problem. We have every reason to be comfortable, but very few reasons to feel necessary. Let your shoulders drop. Notice the weight of your body. You don't have to fix this tonight. You just have to see it clearly. Because once you understand that the emptiness isn't personal, it's structural, you stop blaming yourself. And you start asking better questions. Not, "What's wrong with me?" but "What kind of life am I being asked to live?" Not, Why can't I be happy? But what am I actually here for? And that question, that single question, changes the entire trajectory of your search, because it stops looking for relief and starts looking for meaning. And meaning doesn't arrive through comfort. It arrives through something far stranger, something most people are taught to avoid. It arrives through responsibility, through commitment, through the willingness to choose something that matters more than your own fleeting pleasure. And that's where we turn next, to the great modern mistake, the belief that if you just had more pleasure, you'd finally feel fulfilled. But pleasure, as you're about to see, is the wrong target entirely. Chapter 4. When Pleasure Fails to Fulfill. There's a story Frankl used to tell about a patient who came to him in despair. The man was wealthy, successful, admired. He had access to every pleasure imaginable: fine food, beautiful experiences, exotic travel, and yet he felt nothing. He thought something was broken in him, that he'd lost the ability to enjoy life, that maybe he was depressed. But Frankl saw something else, something deeper. The man wasn't depressed. He was starving, not for more pleasure, but for something pleasure could never provide. Let me show you why. Pleasure is a sensation. It arrives, it peaks, it fades, and then you need more of it to feel the same level of satisfaction. This is how tolerance works. In addiction, in entertainment, in consumer culture, the first time you experience something, it feels significant, novel, alive. But the 10th time, the 100th time, it becomes background noise. Just another thing to check off, another experience to consume and forget. And this is the trap modern life sets for you. It tells you that fulfillment lives on the other side of more. More success, more pleasure, more experiences, more things. But every time you get more, the emptiness remains. Or worse, it deepens. Because pleasure, by its nature, is self-referential. It points back to you, your comfort, your satisfaction, your temporary relief. And a life organized around pleasure becomes a life organized around nothing. Just for a moment, let your breathing slow. Notice the air moving in and out. You don't have to chase anything right now. Now let's trace this pattern more carefully, because it's easier to miss. Imagine someone, we'll call him Daniel. He's in his late 22nd. He works hard. He's been told all his life that if he just achieves enough, he'll finally feel satisfied. So he does. He climbs. He succeeds. He gets the promotion, the recognition, the raise. And for a few days, it feels good. There's a rush, a sense of validation. But then it fades, and he's back where he started, restless, empty, searching. So he tries pleasure. He books a trip. He buys something he's wanted. He indulges in experiences he's been denying himself. And again, temporary relief, followed by the return of emptiness. And this is where the real frustration begins. because he's doing everything right. He's checking every box. He's following the script, and yet nothing works. And that's when the darker thought arrives. Maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I'm broken. Maybe I just don't know how to be happy. But here's the truth he's missing. The truth most people miss: happiness can't be chased. It can only be encountered as a side effect of living meaningfully. And pleasure can't be the goal. It can only be a byproduct of pursuing something beyond yourself. This is one of Frankl's most radical insights. And it contradicts almost everything modern culture teaches you. The culture says, maximize pleasure, minimize pain, optimize your life for comfort and enjoyment. But Frankl says, no, that's the path to emptiness. Because a life aimed at pleasure is a life aimed at nothing. Pleasure is wonderful, it's valuable, it's part of being human, but it can't be the point. The point has to be something outside yourself, something that demands more from you than your own fleeting satisfaction. This is why people who dedicate their lives to a cause often report higher well-being than people who dedicate their lives to their own happiness. Not because the cause brings pleasure, but because it brings meaning. And meaning doesn't fade. Meaning doesn't require escalation. Meaning doesn't leave you empty. Now we can hold this more gently. Think about the last time you felt truly fulfilled. Not just entertained, not just comfortable, but deeply, quietly fulfilled. I'll bet it wasn't a moment of pure pleasure. It was a moment when you contributed something, created something, connected with someone, served something larger than your own temporary comfort. Maybe you helped someone. Maybe you solved a hard problem. Maybe you showed up for someone who needed you. And in that moment, you didn't feel empty. You felt necessary, not because you were happy, but because you mattered. And that's the difference. Pleasure says, I am satisfied. Meaning says, I am necessary. Pleasure asks, what can the world give me? Meaning asks, what can I give the world? Pleasure is passive. Meaning is active. And this is why chasing pleasure always leads back to emptiness. Because pleasure doesn't ask anything of you. It doesn't call you forward. It doesn't make you larger than yourself. It just satisfies, temporarily, until it doesn't. But meaning demands something from you. And in that demand, you become more than you were. Let the next breath be slightly slower. And as you listen, you don't have to do anything. You're starting to see the shape of the real problem and the shape of the real solution. The problem isn't that you lack pleasure. The problem is that you've been aiming at the wrong target. And the solution isn't more of what you've been chasing. It's a complete reorientation away from what feels good and toward what matters, away from what satisfies me and toward what needs me. And that shift, that single shift, opens a doorway into something Frankl called the will to meaning. Not the will to pleasure, not the will to power, but the will to meaning. And that's where we turn next, to the deepest human drive, the one that survives when everything else is stripped away. Chapter 5. The Will to Meaning. There are 3 great drives that shape human behavior. Freud believed the fundamental drive was pleasure, the pursuit of satisfaction, comfort, relief from tension. Adler believed it was power, the pursuit of superiority, competence, overcoming inferiority. But Frankl discovered something deeper, something that persists even when pleasure is impossible and power is stripped away. He called it the will to meaning, and it changes everything. Because if Freud was right, then the concentration camp should have destroyed everyone. No pleasure, no comfort, no relief. And if Adler was right, then the camp should have broken everyone. No power, no status, no control. But that's not what happened. Some people survived. Not because they were stronger, not because they were luckier, but because they had a reason, a why that transcended the unbearable how. And Frankl watched this with his own eyes. He lived it, he documented it, and he realized this is the deepest human need. Not pleasure, not power, but meaning. Let me show you what this looks like. Picture a man in a frozen labor camp. It's before dawn. The temperature is well below freezing. He's starving, exhausted. Every muscle aches. He could give up, lie down, let go. Many did, but he doesn't. Because in his mind, he's having a conversation with his wife. She's not physically there. He doesn't even know if she's alive. But in his imagination, he's telling her about this moment. He's promising her he'll survive. He's holding her face in his mind. And that image, that relationship, that love, gives him a reason to take the next step, and the next, and the next. Not because it brings pleasure, not because it brings power, but because it brings meaning. His life, in that moment, is not about him. It's about her. It's about the possibility of reunion. It's about the story they might still complete together. And that's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything. This is the will to meaning. And it's not an abstract philosophical concept. It's a survival mechanism. It's what keeps you tethered to life when every other reason has dissolved. But here's the part most people overlook quietly. You don't have to be in a concentration camp to need meaning. You need it every day, in every ordinary moment, because without meaning, even comfort becomes unbearable. Think about it. You've had moments, probably many moments, where everything was fine, objectively fine, safe, comfortable, secure, and yet you felt restless, anxious, hollow, not because something was missing externally, but because something was missing internally, a sense of purpose, a sense of direction, a sense that your life was moving towards something that mattered. And without that, even paradise feels like a cage. This is what Frankl meant when he said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." But the inverse is also true. He who has no why cannot bear even the easiest how. You can have everything and feel nothing, or you can have nothing and feel everything. It all depends on whether your life is pointing toward meaning. Now notice the weight of your body where it rests. just for a moment. You don't have to figure this out tonight. You just have to notice it's true. So let's make this more concrete, more personal. Think about the last time you felt truly alive. Not entertained, not distracted, but deeply, unmistakably alive. I'll bet it wasn't a moment of ease. It was a moment of engagement, a moment when you were called to show up, to contribute, to matter. Maybe it was a crisis where someone needed you. Maybe it was a project that demanded your full attention. Maybe it was a conversation where you said something true that helped someone see clearly. In that moment, you weren't asking, "Am I happy?" You were too busy being necessary. And that is what the will to meaning looks like in practice. It's not a feeling, it's a pull, a direction, a call. And the call doesn't say, "Come be comfortable." It says, "Come be useful. Come be needed. Come give what only you can give." And when you answer that call, emptiness dissolves. Not because you're happy, but because you're necessary. This is the deepest human need, more fundamental than pleasure, more fundamental than power, the need to matter, to contribute, to be part of something larger than your own fleeting experience. And modern life, for all its abundance, rarely gives you this. It gives you comfort. It gives you entertainment. It gives you endless ways to fill time, but it rarely asks, "What are you here to give?" And without that question, life becomes a series of distractions, each one less satisfying than the last. But with that question, everything changes. Let the next breath be slightly slower, and with that in mind, we can move forward. Because once you see that meaning is the deepest need, the next question becomes obvious. How do you find it? And that's where most people make a catastrophic mistake. They try to chase it, hunt it down, pursue it directly. But meaning, like happiness, can't be pursued. It can only be encountered as a side effect of something else. And what Frankl discovered is both simple and revolutionary. You don't create meaning. You discover it. You uncover it. You align yourself with it. And the moment you try to chase happiness as a goal, you've already lost. That's where we turn next, to one of the great paradoxes of human psychology. The reason happiness slips away the moment you grasp for it, and why the people who stop chasing happiness are often the ones who find it. Chapter 6. Why happiness cannot be chased. There's a paradox at the heart of human experience. The more you chase happiness, the more it eludes you. The more you try to force meaning, the more hollow it becomes. The more you focus on yourself, the emptier you feel. This isn't poetic, it's psychological. And Frankl called it hyper-reflection, the tendency to turn inward, to monitor your own state, to constantly check, am I happy yet? Am I fulfilled yet? Am I enough yet? And every time you check, you pull yourself further from the thing you're seeking. Let me show you why. Happiness is not a state you can occupy. It's a byproduct, a side effect, a shadow that appears when you're looking somewhere else. You can't aim at happiness any more than you can aim at your own shadow. The moment you turn toward it, it moves away. This is one of the most counterintuitive truths in all of psychology, and it explains why so many people who dedicate their lives to happiness end up miserable, because they're aiming at the wrong target. Imagine someone, we'll call her Sarah. She's been told her whole life that the goal is to be happy, so she organizes her entire existence around that pursuit. She avoids discomfort. She seeks pleasure. She optimizes for ease. She measures every decision by one metric. Will this make me happy? And at first, it seems to work. She feels good, satisfied, on track. But gradually, something shifts. The pleasure starts to feel hollow. The comfort starts to feel suffocating. The ease starts to feel meaningless. She's doing everything right. She's following the formula. But somehow, happiness keeps slipping through her fingers. And the more she chases it, the more anxious she becomes. Am I happy? Should I be happier? What's wrong with me that I'm not happier? And now she's trapped in a loop, monitoring her own state, judging her own experience, constantly checking whether she's arrived at the destination. But the destination keeps receding, because she's turned happiness into a project. And happiness can't survive being a project. This is hyper-reflection, the self-defeating act of turning inward to examine your own fulfillment. And it's one of the most common psychological traps of modern life. Now here's the quieter layer beneath that. Happiness doesn't arrive when you feel good. Happiness arrives when you forget to check whether you feel good. It's the moment you're so absorbed in something meaningful that you stop thinking about yourself entirely. The parent playing with their child, the artist lost in creation, the teacher watching a student finally understand, the friend listening deeply to someone in pain. In those moments, happiness isn't the goal. Connection is. Contribution is. Presence is. But happiness shows up anyway, quietly, as a side effect of forgetting yourself. Frankl used to say, success, like happiness, cannot be pursued. It must ensue, and it only does so as the unintended side effect of one's personal dedication to a cause greater than oneself. Read that again slowly, because it contradicts almost everything you've been taught. You don't pursue happiness. You dedicate yourself to something beyond yourself, and happiness follows. You don't chase meaning. You commit to something that demands meaning, and meaning reveals itself. You don't try to feel fulfilled. You live in a way that fulfillment becomes inevitable. This is the great inversion, the radical reorientation that most people never make. They spend their entire lives chasing the shadow, wondering why it always stays just out of reach. But the people who stop chasing, the people who turn their attention outward towards something that needs them, they stumble into happiness without even trying. Let your shoulders drop. Feel the weight of your body. You don't have to be happy right now. You just have to be here. So let's make this even more concrete. Think about the happiest moment you've had in the last year. Not the most fun, not the most pleasurable, but the most deeply satisfying. I'll bet it wasn't a moment when you were focused on your own happiness. It was a moment when you were focused on something else, someone else, some task that absorbed you completely. Maybe you were helping someone move. Maybe you were cooking a meal for people you love. Maybe you were solving a problem that mattered. Maybe you were having a conversation where both people felt truly seen. In that moment, you weren't thinking, "Am I happy?" You were too busy being present, being useful, being connected, and happiness arrived. Not as a goal, but as a gift. This is what self-transcendence means. The ability to step beyond your own immediate experience and participate in something larger. And it's the antidote to emptiness. Because emptiness is what happens when life becomes entirely self-referential, when every moment is evaluated by how it makes you feel, when every decision is filtered through the question, "Will this serve me?" And the cure. The cure is to stop asking that question. Not because your needs don't matter, but because your needs are best met indirectly, through connection, through contribution, through participation in something beyond yourself. And this is where the real freedom begins. Because once you stop chasing happiness, you stop being held hostage by your own mood. You stop needing life to feel good in order to show up. You stop measuring every day by whether you felt satisfied. Instead, you measure it by whether you mattered, whether you contributed, whether you lived in alignment with something larger than your temporary comfort. And that is a kind of freedom most people never experience. A freedom from the tyranny of your own feelings. A freedom to live meaningfully even when you don't feel good. And here's the paradox. The moment you stop needing to feel good, you often start feeling better. Not because you've found some magic trick, but because you've stopped fighting yourself. You've stopped demanding that life deliver a certain emotional state. You've learned to live with yourself as you are, and to live for something beyond yourself. And that combination, that is where peace lives. Now we can widen the lens. Because what we're describing isn't just happiness. It's the entire structure of modern anxiety. The relentless self-monitoring, the constant internal checking, the exhausting project of trying to feel the right way. Frankl called this existential frustration, the suffering that comes not from lack of pleasure, but from lack of purpose. And it's everywhere, quietly eating away at people's peace, creating a kind of suffering that has no clear name. Not depression exactly, not anxiety exactly, but something deeper, something harder to treat, because it's not a disorder, it's a disconnection. And that's where we turn next. To the quiet epidemic of modern life, the one that doesn't show up in diagnostic manuals, the one that millions of people suffer from without ever knowing it has a name: existential frustration. Chapter 7. Existential frustration. There's a form of suffering that has no physical cause, no chemical imbalance, no trauma you can point to. It's quieter than that, and in some ways more painful. Frankl called it existential frustration, the suffering that comes from living without purpose, from drifting through days that blur together, from having everything you need and feeling like you have nothing. And it's one of the most common experiences of modern life. You've felt it. That restless, gnawing sense that something is missing. Not something you can buy or achieve or fix. Something deeper. A sense of direction. A sense of mattering. A sense that your life is moving towards something beyond your own temporary comfort. And when that's missing, everything else loses its flavor. Success feels hollow. Pleasure feels empty. Relationships feel performative. Days feel like repetitions of the same meaningless script. And you can't quite name what's wrong. You just know that somewhere along the way, you lost the thread. This is existential frustration. And it's not a disorder. It's not something to medicate or pathologize. It's a signal, a call, a reminder that you're living out of alignment with your deeper need for meaning. And the signal gets louder the more you ignore it. Let me show you what this looks like in practice. Picture someone. We'll call him James. He's 40. He's climbed the ladder, made good money, provided for his family, done everything right. But lately, he's been waking up at 3 a.m. with a feeling he can't quite name. Not panic, not sadness, just unease. A sense that he's been running on a treadmill that's going nowhere. He works hard, but the work doesn't feel meaningful. It's just tasks, meetings, deliverables. None of it seems to matter beyond the paycheck. He comes home. But home doesn't feel like a refuge. It feels like another set of obligations. Another role to perform. He's too tired to connect deeply, too distracted to be present, too numb to feel much of anything. And when he finally has a free moment, a weekend, a vacation, instead of relief, he feels nothing. Just emptiness and guilt for feeling empty when he has so much. This is existential frustration, and it's invisible. It doesn't show up in blood tests or brain scans. It doesn't fit neatly into diagnostic categories, but it's real, and it's suffering. Now here's the part that most people overlook quietly. Existential frustration isn't caused by what you lack. It's caused by what you're avoiding. The question you're not asking, the choice you're not making, the life you're not living. And the longer you avoid it, the louder the signal becomes. Frankl used to say that existential frustration is the voice of your unlived potential, the part of you that knows you're capable of more than comfort. The part that's calling you towards something harder, riskier, more meaningful. And that voice doesn't stop. It just gets quieter or louder, depending on how much you're willing to listen. James, in his 3 a.m. wakefulness, is hearing that voice, and he's terrified of what it might be asking. Because it's not asking him to be more successful. It's not asking him to achieve more or acquire more. It's asking him to live differently, to choose differently, to matter differently. And that's terrifying because it might mean letting go of the life he's built, the identity he's invested in, the comfort he's fought so hard to secure. But here's the truth he's circling. The comfort is killing him. Not physically, but spiritually. He's safe, he's secure, he's successful, and he's dying inside because he has no idea what he's living for. Take a slow breath. Let your shoulders drop. You don't have to solve this tonight. You just have to notice it's real. Now, let's trace the pattern more carefully. Because existential frustration doesn't announce itself clearly. It disguises itself as other things. Burnout, restlessness, irritability, a vague sense of dissatisfaction you can't quite pin down. You might think you're just tired, or stressed, or going through a phase. But underneath, the real question is pressing, what am I living for? And if you don't have a good answer, the frustration deepens. You try to fill the void with productivity, or pleasure, or achievement, or distraction, but none of it works because you're trying to solve a philosophical problem with psychological band-aids. And philosophical problems don't respond to band-aids. They respond to clarity, to honesty, to the courage to ask uncomfortable questions. Questions like, if I could design my life from scratch, would it look like this? Questions like, am I living the life I believe in, or the life I think I'm supposed to live? Questions like, when I'm on my deathbed, will I feel like I mattered? These aren't comfortable questions, and that's precisely why most people avoid them. But the avoidance doesn't make the questions go away. It just makes them louder, and eventually the questions become so loud that you can't ignore them anymore. Sometimes that happens through crisis, a health scare, a loss, a moment of confrontation with mortality. Sometimes it happens through quiet desperation, the slow accumulation of hollow days until you can't pretend anymore. And sometimes it happens through grace, a conversation, a book, a moment of clarity that arrives unbidden. But however it happens, the question eventually demands an answer. What are you living for? And that question is both the wound and the cure. Because once you ask it honestly, you can't go back to sleepwalking. You can't go back to pretending comfort is enough. You can't go back to living as if your life doesn't matter. You have to choose, actively, consciously, with your eyes open. And that choice, that is where freedom begins. Not the freedom from constraint, but the freedom to respond, to decide, to shape your life around something that matters. This is what Frankl meant by existential frustration. It's not the problem, it's the wake-up call. The signal that you're ready for something more, something deeper, something real. And ignoring the signal doesn't make it go away. It just makes the suffering worse. But answering the signal, following it, letting it guide you toward a life that actually matters, that's where transformation begins. And that's where we turn next, to one of the strangest forms of modern suffering, the kind that has no object, no clear cause, no enemy to fight, the suffering of anxiety without a reason, fear without a target, dread without a name. Frankl called it neugenic neurosis, and understanding it changes everything about how you relate to your own mind. Chapter 8, Anxiety Without an Object. There's a kind of anxiety that has no clear cause. You're not afraid of anything specific. You're not in danger. Nothing bad has happened. And yet, dread. a low hum of unease that follows you through the day, a sense that something is wrong even when everything is fine. You try to identify the source. Is it work, relationships, health, money? But nothing quite fits. The anxiety isn't about any particular thing, it's just there. Persistent, unfocused, exhausting. This is what Frankl called neogenic neurosis. Anxiety that doesn't come from your body or your circumstances, it comes from your spirit, from the void where meaning should be. And it's one of the most misunderstood forms of suffering in modern life. Because when you can't identify what you're anxious about, you assume something is wrong with you, that your nervous system is broken, that you need medication or therapy or some intervention to fix your faulty wiring. But Frankl would say, maybe nothing is wrong with you. Maybe your anxiety is rational, not about the present danger, but about the deeper absence. The absence of purpose, the absence of direction, the absence of something worth living for, and your body. Your body knows. Even when your mind tries to pretend everything is fine, let me show you what this looks like. Picture someone. We'll call her Emma. She's 28, she's healthy, she has a good job. She has friends. Her life is stable, but every morning she wakes up with a tightness in her chest, a sense that she needs to be somewhere, do something, fix something. But there's nothing to fix. No crisis, no emergency, just day after day of routines that feel increasingly pointless. She's tried everything: therapy, meditation, exercise, medication, and some of it helps, temporarily, but the anxiety always returns. Because the anxiety isn't the problem, it's the symptom. The real problem is that Emma doesn't know what she's living for, and somewhere deep inside, her body is sounding the alarm. Not because she's in danger, but because she's drifting. And drift, for a human being, is its own kind of emergency. Now notice what happens when we look closer. Emma's anxiety has no object. She's not afraid of failure. She's not afraid of rejection. She's not afraid of death. She's afraid of meaninglessness, of arriving at the end of her life and realizing she never really lived, that she spent decades going through the motions without ever asking, what is this for? And that fear is existential. It's not about threat, it's about waste. The terror of wasting the one precious life you have on things that don't matter. And when you feel that terror but can't name it, it manifests as anxiety, free-floating, objectless, everywhere and nowhere. Frankl saw this pattern constantly. People would come to him with panic attacks, insomnia, psychosomatic symptoms. And when he dug deeper, the root wasn't trauma, it wasn't brain chemistry, it was spiritual emptiness. They had lost, or never found, a sense of meaning, and their bodies were protesting, not with words, with sensation, with the only language the body knows, discomfort. And this is where the real insight emerges. Because once you understand that the anxiety is existential, you stop trying to eliminate it with comfort, You start listening to what it's asking for. It's not asking for safety. You're already safe. It's not asking for pleasure. You have access to pleasure. It's asking for meaning, for purpose, for a reason to endure. And until you provide that, the anxiety persists. This is both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it means the solution isn't easy. You can't medicate it away. You can't distract it away. You can't achieve it away. The only solution is to confront the question the anxiety is asking, what are you living for? But it's also liberating because it means you're not broken. Your anxiety isn't a malfunction. It's intelligence. It's your deepest self refusing to accept a life that feels hollow. And that refusal, that is something to honor, not to silence. Let your breathing slow. Just for a moment, feel the air moving in and out. You don't have to fix this right now. You just have to notice what it's asking. So let's make this more practical, more personal. If you're lying here at night with that familiar sense of unease, and you can't quite name what you're worried about, ask yourself this. If I knew my life mattered, would I still feel this way? If I knew I was contributing something real, would this anxiety dissolve? If I had a purpose that felt larger than my own comfort, would this dread still follow me? And if the answer is no, if knowing you mattered would change everything, then you're not suffering from anxiety disorder. You're suffering from meaning disorder, and the cure isn't medication. It's reorientation, not away from the anxiety, but toward what the anxiety is pointing at, the unlived life, the unchosen path, the potential you're carrying but not expressing. Frankl used to say, man's search for meaning is the primary motivation in his life. And when that search is frustrated, anxiety fills the void. This is the truth most people miss. The anxiety isn't the problem, the void is. And you can't fill the void with comfort. You can only fill it with meaning, which means the path forward isn't easier. It's harder. It's riskier, it's more demanding, but it's also the only path that works. Because anxiety without meaning is suffering, but anxiety with meaning is just life, just the normal human experience of caring about something beyond yourself. And that kind of anxiety that you can live with, because it's not telling you something is wrong, it's telling you something matters. And when something matters, you show up, even when it's hard, even when you're afraid. You show up because the alternative, the comfortable, safe, meaningless alternative, is worse than any temporary discomfort. And once you understand that, everything changes. The anxiety doesn't disappear, but it transforms from enemy to guide, from symptom to signal. And you stop asking, how do I get rid of this feeling? And start asking, what is this feeling asking me to become? And that question opens a doorway into something much darker, much harder to face. The intersection of anxiety, emptiness, and despair. The place where meaninglessness becomes not just uncomfortable, but unbearable. The place Frankl called depression born of existential vacuum. And that's where we turn next. Chapter 9. Depression and meaninglessness. There's a kind of depression that medication can't touch. Not because the medication is wrong, but because the depression isn't chemical. It's philosophical. It's what happens when you lose the thread, when life stops making sense, when you wake up every morning and can't find a reason to get out of bed, not because you're sad, but because you don't see the point. This is existential depression, and Frankl saw it everywhere. People who had everything: health, wealth, security, love, and yet they felt nothing. Just a grey flatness, a sense that nothing mattered, that all of it, the work, the relationships, the achievements, was just arbitrary, meaningless, a game they were too tired to keep playing. And when they went to doctors, they were diagnosed, treated, medicated. But the depression persisted, because the real problem wasn't in their brain chemistry, it was in their life structure. They were living without meaning, and the depression was their mind's way of saying, "This isn't working. This isn't enough. You need something more. Let me show you what this looks like." Picture someone, we'll call him Michael. He's 52. He's been successful by every conventional metric: career, family, financial security. But lately, he's been fading. Not in any dramatic way, just quietly pulling back from life. He goes through the motions, shows up to work, comes home, eats dinner, watches something, goes to sleep. But inside, he feels nothing. No joy, no sadness, no anger, just absence. His wife notices. She asks what's wrong. He says he's fine. And technically, he is. Nothing is wrong. But nothing is right either. He's been to therapy. He's tried antidepressants. And they help a little. The sharp edges soften. The heaviness lifts slightly. But the core problem remains. He doesn't care about anything. He's lost the thread that used to hold it all together. The thread that said, "This matters. This is worth doing. This is why you're here." And without that thread, everything unravels. This is existential depression. And it's different from clinical depression in one critical way. Clinical depression says everything is bad. Existential depression says nothing matters. One is about pain, the other is about pointlessness. And pointlessness. Pointlessness is its own unique form of suffering. Now here's the quieter layer beneath that. Most people who experience existential depression don't recognize it as such. They think they're just depressed, or burned out, or going through a phase. But the real problem is that they've lost their why. And without a why, even the easiest how becomes unbearable. You can endure almost anything if you have a reason, but you can't endure even comfort if it feels pointless. Frankl proved this in the camps. Some people facing unimaginable horror found reasons to survive, a person to return to, a mission to complete, a testimony to give, and those reasons kept them alive. not because the reasons made the suffering less, but because the reasons made the suffering meaningful. But in the modern world, the problem is inverted. You have comfort, you have security, you have everything that should make life bearable. But you have no reason, no why, no sense that any of it is pointing anywhere. And that can be harder to endure than physical suffering, because at least physical suffering has a clear enemy, something to fight, something to overcome. But existential depression, it has no enemy, just absence, just the quiet knowledge that you're drifting through a life that doesn't matter. And that knowledge is corrosive. It eats away at motivation, at connection, at the will to engage with anything at all. Let the next breath be slightly slower. And as you listen, you don't have to do anything. You're starting to see the shape of something important. Michael's depression isn't about chemical imbalance. It's about spiritual emptiness. And the solution isn't medication, it's meaning. But here's the problem. You can't just decide to find meaning. You can't force it. You can't manufacture it. Meaning has to be discovered, uncovered, encountered in the wild terrain of your actual life. And that requires something most people find terrifying: honesty. The willingness to look at your life and ask, is this really what I believe in? Or is this just what I've been doing because it seemed like the right path? The willingness to acknowledge, I've been living for comfort, for approval, for the absence of discomfort, but not for anything that actually matters. And once you acknowledge that, you can't go back. You can't pretend anymore. You have to choose. Either you keep living the comfortable, meaningless life and accept the depression as the cost, or you risk something. You choose something. You commit to something that might actually matter, even if it's harder, riskier, more uncertain. And that choice is terrifying, because it means letting go of the life you've built, the identity you've invested in, the safety you've secured. But it's also the only path forward, because the alternative is slow death, not physical death, but spiritual death, the gradual fading of your will to engage with anything at all. And Frankl would say, that fading is not a disease, it's a response, a rational response to a life without purpose. Your mind is simply refusing to pretend anymore, refusing to invest energy in something that feels arbitrary. And that refusal, that is actually a sign of health, a sign of integrity, a sign that somewhere deep inside you still know you're capable of more than this. Now we can hold this more gently. If you're feeling this flatness, this sense that nothing matters, you're not broken, you're not weak, you're not failing, you're just honest. Honest enough to notice that comfort isn't enough, that safety isn't enough, that going through the motions isn't enough, and that honesty that is the first step towards something real. Because once you stop pretending, you can start choosing, actively, consciously, with your eyes open. Not choosing comfort, not choosing approval, not choosing safety, but choosing meaning, choosing purpose, choosing to live in a way that makes the depression obsolete, not by eliminating it, but by giving yourself something worth being depressed about losing. And that shift from meaningless comfort to meaningful struggle is where everything changes. Frankl used to say, what man actually needs is not a tensionless state, but rather the striving and struggling for a worthwhile goal, a freely chosen task. Read that again slowly, because it contradicts everything modern culture tells you. The culture says, eliminate stress, maximize ease, avoid struggle, but Frankl says, no. You need struggle. You need tension. Not random tension, but meaningful tension. The tension that comes from pursuing something that matters. And when you have that, the depression doesn't disappear, but it transforms. From emptiness to engagement, from flatness to aliveness, from nothing matters to this matters, and it's hard, and I'm showing up anyway. And that is the antidote. Not comfort, not medication, not distraction, but meaning, purpose, the willingness to live for something beyond your own temporary ease. And once you understand that, the next question becomes obvious. If you need meaning, but you can't force it or create it, where does it come from? And that's where we turn next. To the heart of Frankl's philosophy, the place where freedom actually lives. Not in the absence of constraints, but in the presence of choice. The ability to respond to life on your own terms, no matter what life has dealt you. This is where everything changes. Because once you see that freedom isn't about your circumstances, you realize you've had it all along. You just forgot how to use it. Chapter 10. Freedom and Inner Choice. There's a moment in every person's life when they realize, I am not my circumstances. I am not what happened to me. I am not my past. I am not even my feelings. I am what I choose in response to all of that. And that realization, that single realization, is the birth of true freedom. Not freedom from constraint, but freedom to respond. This is what Frankl discovered in the camps, and it's what he spent the rest of his life teaching. Even in the most extreme circumstances, stripped of every external freedom, every comfort, every dignity, you still have one freedom that can never be taken. The freedom to choose your attitude, your response, the meaning you assign to what's happening. And that freedom, that is everything. Let me show you what this looks like. Picture two people in the same situation, both in the camp, both suffering the same cold, the same hunger, the same brutality. One person collapses inward, becomes bitter, decides that life is cruel and meaningless, that survival is just prolonging suffering. The other person finds a thread of meaning, a reason to endure, a why that makes the how bearable. Same circumstances, different response. And that difference determines everything. Not who lives and who dies. That was often arbitrary. But who retains their humanity and who loses it? Who remains themselves and who becomes just a shell? And the deciding factor wasn't strength, wasn't luck, wasn't even will in the conventional sense. It was choice. The small, daily, moment-by-moment choice of how to respond. To despair or to hope. To bitterness or to love. To meaninglessness or to purpose. And Frankl watched this over and over. The people who survived with their dignity intact weren't the strongest or the most fortunate. They were the ones who chose meaning, even when meaning seemed impossible. Now here's the part that most people miss. Quietly. This isn't just true in extreme circumstances. It's true in every moment of every day. You have circumstances you didn't choose. A body you didn't design, a history you can't rewrite, feelings you can't control, but you have one thing you can control: how you respond. And that response, that is your freedom, that is your power, that is where your dignity lives, not in what happens to you, but in what you make of what happens to you. Let me make this more concrete, more personal. Think about a moment when you felt powerless, when life dealt you something you didn't want, something unfair, something painful. Maybe it was a loss, a betrayal, a failure, a diagnosis. In that moment, you had two options. You could surrender to bitterness, to victimhood, to the story that life is cruel and you are helpless, or you could choose differently. Not to pretend everything is fine, not to bypass the pain, but to decide what the pain would make of you. Would it make you harder or softer? Would it make you bitter or compassionate? Would it make you smaller or larger? And that choice is freedom. Not the freedom to avoid suffering, but the freedom to decide what the suffering means. This is what Frankl called the last of the human freedoms, the one that survives even when everything else is taken. And it's not abstract. It's practical. It's how you navigate every difficult moment. The moment your partner says something hurtful, you don't choose whether it hurts, but you choose what you do with the hurt. Do you retaliate, withdraw, or do you pause, breathe, and respond with the person you want to be? The moment your work feels pointless, you don't choose whether it feels pointless, but you choose whether you let that feeling define your engagement. Do you coast, complain, or do you find a thread of meaning, even a small one, and hold on to it? The moment you feel anxious, empty, restless, you don't choose whether you feel that way, but you choose how you relate to the feeling. Do you fight it, judge yourself for it, or do you listen to what it's asking for? And in each of those moments, you are free. Not free from the situation, but free within it. And that freedom, that is what makes you human. Animals react. Circumstances determine their behavior. Stimulus leads to response with no space between. But humans have a gap, a pause, a moment where choice lives. Between stimulus and response, there is space. And in that space lies your freedom. Frankl would say, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space, is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. And once you see that space, you can never unsee it. You start to notice it everywhere. The tiny pause before you react. The moment where you could choose differently. The opportunity to respond from who you want to be, rather than who you've been. And the more you practice using that space, the larger it becomes. You become less reactive, more intentional, more free. Not because your circumstances improved, but because you learned to choose your response. This is the heart of Frankl's philosophy, and it's what makes his work so different from other approaches to meaning and psychology. He's not saying change your circumstances, fix your problems, eliminate your suffering. He's saying change your relationship to your circumstances. Choose your response to your problems. Find meaning in your suffering. And that shift from trying to control what happens to you to choosing how you respond to what happens is where everything changes. Because you can't control most of what happens. Life is uncertain, painful, unfair at times, but you can always control your response. And your response is where your freedom lives. Let your shoulders drop. Feel the weight of your body. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to choose. And so the question becomes, how do you practice this freedom? How do you actually use the space between stimulus and response? First, you notice. You catch yourself reacting automatically. You see the pattern, the habitual response that doesn't serve you. Then you pause, just for a moment, just long enough to create space. And in that space, you ask, what kind of person do I want to be in this moment? Not what would feel good, but what would matter. And then you choose, even imperfectly, even uncertainly. You choose the response that aligns with the person you want to be. And gradually, choice by choice, you become that person. Not by changing your circumstances, but by changing your relationship to them. This is self-determination. This is agency. This is the freedom that survives even when everything else is taken. And it's available to you right now, in this moment, in every moment. You don't need perfect circumstances. You just need to remember you are free to choose your response. And that freedom that is more powerful than any external change. Because external circumstances change constantly. But the freedom to choose your response, that stays with you always. No matter what happens. No matter how hard it gets. No matter how unfair life becomes. You still have choice. You still have freedom. You still have the ability to decide what it all means. And that is where dignity lives, where humanity lives, where meaning becomes possible even in impossible situations. This is the foundation, the ground on which everything else is built. Because once you know you're free to choose your response, you can start asking the harder questions. What should I choose? What is worth responding to? What kind of suffering is worth enduring? And that's where we turn next. to one of the most difficult truths in all of philosophy, the truth that makes most people uncomfortable, the truth that modern culture tries desperately to deny: suffering is inevitable. It's part of being human, and trying to eliminate it completely is both impossible and unwise. But finding meaning in suffering, choosing how you respond to it, letting it shape you into someone deeper, wiser, more compassionate, that is possible. And that is where transformation lives. Chapter 11. Suffering as Human Destiny. Here's the truth most people don't want to hear. You will suffer, no matter how careful you are, no matter how much you optimize, no matter how much you try to control. Suffering isn't optional. It's woven into the structure of being human. You will lose people you love. You will fail at things that matter. You will age. You will face illness. You will confront mortality. And trying to avoid all of that is trying to avoid life itself. This is one of Frankl's most radical claims, and it contradicts almost everything modern culture promises you. The culture says suffering is the enemy. Eliminate it, avoid it, minimize it at all costs. But Frankl says, no, suffering is inevitable. And more than that, it's essential. Not because suffering is good in itself, but because how you respond to suffering is where meaning reveals itself most clearly. Let me show you what this means. There are three kinds of unavoidable suffering. Frankl called them the tragic triad. First, pain, physical or emotional, the ache of loss, the sting of failure, the weight of difficulty. Second, guilt, the knowledge that you've made mistakes, that you've hurt people, that you can't undo the past. Third, death, the reality that your time is limited, that everyone you love will die, that you will die. And every human being encounters all three. No exceptions. No escape. But here's the critical part. Your suffering doesn't have to be meaningless. In fact, your suffering can be one of the most profound sources of meaning in your life. Not because you seek it out, not because you romanticize it, but because you learn to respond to it with dignity, courage, and wisdom. Now notice what happens when we look closer. Picture someone going through grief. They've lost someone they love. The pain is real, raw, overwhelming. They have two options. They can resist the grief, push it away, numb it, distract from it, try to get back to normal as quickly as possible, or they can allow it, feel it, let it move through them, and in the allowing, let it teach them something about love, about loss, about what it means to be human. The first option feels easier, but it leads to stagnation. The grief doesn't go away, it just goes underground. It becomes a weight they carry unconsciously. The second option is harder, unbearably hard, but it leads to transformation. The grief becomes part of who they are, not in a way that breaks them, but in a way that deepens them. And that depth, that is meaning, not happiness, not comfort, but the kind of wisdom that only comes through suffering. This is what Frankl meant when he said, in some way, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning. Not that the pain goes away, but that the pain becomes part of something larger, part of your story, part of your growth, part of your contribution to the world. Let me make this more concrete. Think about the hardest thing you've ever been through, the thing that almost broke you. Maybe it was a loss, a betrayal, a failure, a period of darkness you thought you'd never escape. And in that moment, it felt meaningless, cruel, unfair. Why me? Why this? Why now? But if you're still here, listening to this, something changed. Maybe it didn't change right away. Maybe it took years. But at some point, you realized that suffering shaped me. It made me more compassionate, more patient, more grateful, more real. It burned away the parts of me that were inauthentic, superficial, unexamined, and what remained was stronger, truer, more aligned with who I actually am. And that is meaning emerging from suffering, not because the suffering was good, but because your response to the suffering was dignified, courageous, human. This is the paradox Frankl discovered. Sometimes suffering is the only path to certain kinds of growth. You can't learn compassion without encountering pain, yours or someone else's. You can't learn courage without facing fear. You can't learn wisdom without making mistakes. You can't learn love without risking loss. And trying to eliminate all suffering is trying to eliminate all growth. It's trying to stay safe, small, protected, but never really alive. And that is the real tragedy. Not the suffering itself, but the unlived life. The person you never became because you were too afraid to risk suffering. Let the next breath be slightly slower. And as you listen, you don't have to do anything. You're starting to see something important, something most people miss. The goal isn't to eliminate suffering. The goal is to make suffering meaningful, to face it with dignity, to let it teach you, to allow it to shape you into someone deeper, kinder, more real. And when you do that, the suffering doesn't disappear, but it transforms from enemy to teacher, from burden to gift, from meaningless pain to meaningful growth. Frankl used to tell a story about an elderly general practitioner who came to him in deep depression. His wife had died 2 years earlier, and he couldn't move forward. He said he couldn't overcome the grief. And Frankl asked him, "What would have happened if you had died first and your wife had to survive you?" The man said, "For her, that would have been terrible. She would have suffered terribly." And Frankl said, "You see, you have spared her that suffering, but now you have to pay for it by surviving and mourning her." And in that moment, the man's suffering found meaning. Not that it went away, but that it became bearable, because it wasn't arbitrary. It was the cost of a deep love, the price of having lived a life where someone mattered that much. And that meaning made the suffering endurable. This is what Frankl discovered over and over. Suffering without meaning is unbearable, but suffering with meaning is just life, the full human experience. And once you stop trying to eliminate suffering and start asking, what can I learn from this? What can this make of me? How can this deepen me? Everything changes. You stop being a victim of your circumstances, and you start being a participant in your own transformation. You stop asking, why me? And start asking, what now? And that shift from victim to agent is where freedom lives. Not freedom from suffering, but freedom within suffering. The ability to choose your response, to decide what the suffering means, to determine what it will make of you. And that is the heart of human dignity. So when you encounter suffering, and you will, remember this: the suffering is not the problem, the meaninglessness is. And you have the power to create meaning, not by denying the pain, but by choosing how you respond to it, with courage, with honesty, with the willingness to let it teach you something you couldn't have learned any other way. And when you do that, you transform. You become more than you were. You discover depths you didn't know you had. And that transformation, that is where meaning lives, in the space between suffering and response, in the choice to let difficulty make you better, not bitter. And once you understand that, you're ready for the next layer. The next question: if suffering can be meaningful, what is the highest form of meaning? What is the ultimate source of purpose in a human life? And that's where we turn next, to the most powerful force in human existence, the one thing that survives even death, the thing that makes even the hardest suffering endurable: love. Chapter 12. Love as ultimate meaning. There's a reason love survives everything else. When pleasure fades, when success feels hollow, when even meaning becomes abstract, love remains. Not as a feeling, not as a temporary emotion, but as a choice, an orientation, a way of being in the world that transcends your own immediate experience. And Frankl believed that love, real love, is the highest form of meaning a human being can experience. Not because it feels good, though often it does, but because it requires you to step completely beyond yourself, to care about something more than your own comfort, to be necessary in a way that changes who you are. This is the heart of everything, and it's where we need to spend time. Let me show you what Frankl meant by love. In the camps, in the darkest moments, when everything else had been stripped away, the people who survived were often the people who loved. Not in some abstract, philosophical sense, but concretely, specifically. A man who held the image of his wife in his mind, even though he didn't know if she was alive, even though he might never see her again. The image sustained him, not because it brought comfort, but because it gave him a reason to endure. He would survive for her. He would hold on to his humanity for her. He would keep the possibility of reunion alive, even when reunion seemed impossible. And that love, that specific, grounded, chosen love, kept him human when everything else tried to reduce him to an animal. This is what Frankl meant when he wrote, "Love is the only way to grasp another human being in the innermost core of his personality. To love someone is to see them, not as they appear, not as they perform, but as they actually are, in their full, irreducible humanity. And that seeing that is sacred, because when you love someone that way, you're not using them, you're not projecting onto them, you're not needing them to be anything other than what they are. You're simply witnessing them, honoring them, choosing them over and over. And that choice is the deepest form of meaning. Now here's the quieter layer beneath that. Love isn't just romantic. It's not just between partners. It's a way of being. You can love your children, your friends, your work, your community, even strangers. Not with the same intensity, but with the same quality, the same willingness to step beyond yourself and care about something beyond your own temporary comfort. And the more you practice that kind of love, the more meaning floods your life. Not because love is easy. It's not. It's hard. It's risky. It requires vulnerability. It opens you to loss. But it also opens you to the only thing that makes life worth living: connection. Real, deep, irreplaceable connection. Let me make this more concrete, more personal. Think about someone you love, really love. Not just like, not just need, but love. Now imagine them in front of you. Picture their face, their gestures, the way they move through the world. In this moment, you're not thinking about what they can give you. You're not calculating whether they're useful or convenient. You're just seeing them in their full humanity, with all their flaws and beauty and complexity. And in that seeing, something happens. You forget yourself. Your worries recede. Your self-concern fades. Because in that moment, you're not the center of the world. They are. And that is self-transcendence. That is meaning. That is the highest form of human experience. Not happiness, not pleasure, not even peace, but love. The willingness to care about something beyond yourself so much that your own experience becomes secondary. And Frankl would say, that is what you're here for. That is your purpose. Not to maximize your own satisfaction, but to love, to contribute, to give what only you can give. And when you live that way, emptiness becomes impossible, not because your life is easy, but because it's necessary. You matter. You're needed. You're part of something larger than yourself. And that is enough. More than enough. Take a slow breath. Let your shoulders drop. You don't have to be perfect at this. You just have to try. Now let's look at the shadow side. Because love isn't just beautiful, it's also terrifying. To love someone is to risk losing them, to grief, to change, to death. And that risk is what makes love meaningful. Because love without risk is just comfort. It's just mutual convenience. It's not real. Real love says, I choose you, even though I might lose you. I see you, even though you might disappoint me. I commit to you, even though you might hurt me. And that commitment, that is courage, that is faith, that is meaning in its purest form. Frankl used to talk about the way his wife's image sustained him in the camps. He would imagine conversations with her. He would picture her smile. He would hold her in his mind like a talisman. And years later, after the liberation, he learned she had died. She had been gone the entire time he was surviving for her. And yet, the love remained. It had kept him human. It had given him a reason to endure. It had shaped every choice he made. And that love, even though the object of it was gone, was still the most meaningful thing in his life. Because love isn't contingent on reciprocation. It's not dependent on outcome. It doesn't require the other person to be present or alive or even aware. Love is a choice you make, an orientation you hold, a way of being in the world. And once you choose it, it changes you forever. This is what Frankl meant when he said love is the ultimate form of meaning, because it requires everything from you: your vulnerability, your courage, your willingness to care about something beyond yourself. And in return, it gives you everything. Not happiness, not comfort, but purpose, direction, the sense that your life matters because you've chosen to love. And that sense, that is what you've been searching for all along. Not pleasure, not success, not even peace, but the ability to love, to contribute, to give what only you can give. And that ability, that is available to you right now, in this moment, in every moment. You don't need perfect circumstances. You just need to choose to see someone, really see them. Choose to care about something beyond your own comfort. Choose to love, even when it's hard, even when it's risky, even when you might lose what you love. Because that choice, that single, daily, moment-by-moment choice, is where meaning lives. And once you understand that, the next question becomes obvious. How do you actually do this? How do you step beyond yourself? How do you transcend your own immediate experience and participate in something larger? And that's where we turn next, to one of Frankl's most powerful concepts, the thing that makes love possible, the thing that makes meaning achievable: self-transcendence, the ability to forget yourself, to step beyond your own concerns, to become more than you were by caring about something beyond yourself. And once you learn this, everything changes. Chapter 13, Self-Transcendence. There's a strange paradox at the heart of human fulfillment. The more you focus on yourself, the emptier you feel. The more you forget yourself, the fuller you become. This is self-transcendence, and it's the key to everything. Frankl used to say, being human always points and is directed to something or someone other than oneself. Read that slowly, because it contradicts almost everything modern self-help tells you. The culture says, focus on yourself, prioritize yourself, put yourself first. But Frankl says, no, that's the path to emptiness. The path to meaning is through others, through causes, through something that demands you step beyond your own immediate experience. And that stepping beyond that is where you actually find yourself. Not by looking inward, but by looking outward. Not by asking, "Who am I?" but by asking, "What am I called to do?" And in the doing, you discover who you are. Let me show you what this looks like in practice. Picture someone in a moment of flow, completely absorbed in something, creating art, solving a problem, helping someone, engaged in work that matters. In that moment, they're not thinking about themselves. They're not monitoring their feelings. They're not checking whether they're happy or fulfilled or progressing toward their goals. They're just present, absorbed, necessary. And in that absorption, something strange happens. The self-concern dissolves. The anxiety quiets. The emptiness fades. Not because they've found some technique for managing their inner state, but because they've forgotten to check their inner state at all. They're too busy being useful, being necessary, being engaged. And that engagement, that is self-transcendence. Not losing yourself, but transcending yourself. Becoming more than yourself by participating in something larger. This is the opposite of self-absorption, and it's the antidote to existential vacuum, because the vacuum only exists when you're focused inward, when you're constantly checking, am I fulfilled, am I happy, am I enough? But the moment you turn outward, toward a person, a cause, a task, the vacuum disappears, not because it's been filled, but because you've stepped beyond it entirely. Now here's the part that most people miss, quietly. Self-transcendence isn't sacrifice. It's not giving up your needs for someone else's. It's discovering that your deepest need is to be necessary, to matter, to contribute something real. And the more you do that, the more fulfilled you become. Not as a goal, but as a byproduct. This is the great inversion, the thing that changes everything. You don't find meaning by looking for it. You find it by forgetting to look. By being so engaged in something meaningful, that meaning becomes self-evident. Let me make this more practical, more immediate. Think about the last time you helped someone, really helped them. Not out of obligation, but because you saw they needed something and you could provide it. Maybe you listened to a friend in pain. Maybe you solved a problem for a colleague. Maybe you showed up for someone when they were struggling. In that moment, were you thinking about your own fulfillment, your own happiness, your own progress towards self-actualization? No. You were too busy being present, being useful, being there. And yet, afterward, you probably felt more fulfilled than you had in weeks. Not because you were chasing fulfillment, but because you forgot to chase it. This is self-transcendence, and it's available in every moment, not just in grand gestures, but in small ones, daily ones. The moment you really listen to someone instead of waiting to speak, the moment you do something well, not for recognition, but because it's worth doing well. The moment you care about something beyond your own immediate comfort, in each of those moments, you're transcending yourself, becoming more than yourself, participating in something larger. And that participation, that is where meaning lives. Let your breathing slow, just for a moment. Feel the air moving in and out. You don't have to achieve anything right now. You just have to notice what's possible. So, how do you practice self-transcendence? How do you actually step beyond yourself? First, you notice where you're stuck in self-absorption, where you're constantly monitoring your own state, where you're asking, am I happy? Am I fulfilled? Am I progressing? And then you redirect, not away from your needs, but towards something that needs you. It could be a person, a project, a cause. Doesn't matter. What matters is that you're needed, that something beyond yourself depends on your engagement. And then you show up fully, without reservation, without constantly checking whether you're getting what you need. You just give, contribute, participate, and in the giving, you receive, not as a transaction, but as a natural consequence. Because when you're necessary, emptiness becomes impossible. When you matter, meaning becomes self-evident. This is what Frankl meant by self-transcendence. It's not about losing yourself. It's about finding yourself through others, through causes, through engagement. And the more you practice it, the more natural it becomes. You stop asking, what's in it for me? And start asking, what can I give? You stop measuring every moment by how it makes you feel, and start measuring it by whether you showed up, whether you mattered, whether you contributed. And that shift from self-focus to other focus is where everything changes. Not because you stop mattering to yourself, but because you start mattering to something larger than yourself. And that is where peace lives, where fulfillment lives, where meaning lives. Not in the absence of self, but in the transcendence of self, in the willingness to care about something so much that your own concerns become secondary. And when you live that way, the questions that used to torment you, am I enough? Am I happy? Am I fulfilled? Simply stop being relevant. Because you're too busy being necessary. And being necessary is the deepest form of fulfillment. This is the culmination of everything we've explored. The emptiness, the frustration, the anxiety, the depression, the suffering, they all point to the same solution. Step beyond yourself. Care about something beyond your own experience. Let yourself be necessary. And when you do that, meaning arrives, not as a feeling, but as a reality. The simple, undeniable reality that you matter, that your life has purpose, that you're part of something larger. And that reality, that is what you've been searching for all along. Now, as we move toward the close of this journey, there's one more thing to explore, one more layer to integrate. We've talked about meaning, about suffering, about love, about transcendence. But how do you actually live this? How do you take these ideas and make them real in your daily life? And that's where we turn next, to the practice, the embodiment, the way you rest in meaning, not as a concept, but as a lived experience. This is where everything we've discussed becomes actual, becomes tangible, becomes yours. Chapter 14. Resting in Meaning. You've been listening for a long time now, and maybe you're wondering, how do I actually do this? How do I live meaningfully? How do I rest in meaning instead of chasing it? This is the practice, the embodiment, the way you take everything we've explored and make it real. Not as a project, not as another thing to achieve, but as a way of being, a way of moving through the world that feels aligned with who you actually are. So let's make this simple, concrete, something you can begin tonight. First, understand this. Meaning isn't something you create, it's something you uncover. It's already there, woven into the fabric of your life, in your relationships, your responsibilities, your suffering, your choices. You just have to learn to see it. And seeing it, that's a practice, a daily, moment-by-moment practice of attention. So here's the first practice. Start asking better questions. Not, am I happy? But am I living in alignment with what matters? Not, what do I want? But what is being asked of me? Not, how can I feel better? But how can I be more useful? These questions change everything because they shift your orientation from inward to outward, from receiving to giving, from consuming to contributing. And that shift, that is where meaning begins. Now, let's get more specific. Let's talk about how to actually embody this. Practice 1. The daily question. Every morning, before you start your day, ask yourself, what is one thing I can do today that would be meaningful? Not fun, not easy, not pleasant, but meaningful. Something that would matter, something that would contribute, something that would align with the person you want to be. And then do that thing, even if it's hard, even if you don't feel like it, even if no one notices. Do it because it matters. And that mattering, that is enough. Practice 2. The evening reflection. Every night, before you sleep, ask yourself, in what way was I necessary today? Not, was I happy, but did I matter? Did someone need you? Did you show up for something? Did you contribute in some small way? And if the answer is yes, notice that. Let it land. Let yourself feel the quiet satisfaction of having mattered. And if the answer is no, I notice that too. Without judgment, just clarity, and let it inform tomorrow. Let it guide you toward moments where you can be necessary. Practice 3. The attention shift. Throughout the day, when you notice yourself spiraling inward into anxiety, rumination, self-concern, practice this. Pause. Notice the spiral, and then ask, what can I do right now that would be useful? Not to avoid the feeling, but to redirect your attention towards something that needs you. It could be as simple as washing a dish, sending a kind message, helping someone with a task. Doesn't matter what it is. What matters is that you've shifted from self-absorption to contribution. And that shift, that is self-transcendence in action. Practice 4, the gratitude inventory. Once a day, take a moment to notice 3 things you're grateful for, but not just any things. Notice 3 things that wouldn't exist without someone else's effort, someone else's love, someone else's contribution. The food you ate, the roof over your head, the knowledge you've gained, the safety you experience. All of it, given to you by others, by people you'll never meet, by systems you'll never fully understand. And let that gratitude become humility, and let that humility become generosity. Because you've been given so much, and now you can give back in your own way, with your own gifts. Practice 5, the suffering question. When you encounter difficulty, and you will, pause and ask, what can this teach me? Not why me, but what now? Not this is unfair, but what meaning can I find in this? And then listen. Let the difficulty speak. Let it show you what you're capable of, what you care about, what you're willing to endure for. Because suffering without meaning is unbearable, but suffering with meaning is just life, the full human experience. And finally, practice 6, the love reminder. Once a day, think of someone you love. Picture their face. Hold them in your mind for a moment. And then ask, how can I love them better today? Not, what do I need from them? But, what can I give them? And then, do something. Even something small. A message, a gesture, a moment of presence. Because love isn't just a feeling, it's a practice. A daily, active, chosen practice of seeing someone and caring about their well-being as much as your own. And that practice, that is the highest form of meaning. Now let your shoulders drop. Feel the weight of your body. You don't have to do all of this. You just have to start somewhere with something. Because meaning isn't a destination, it's a direction. And every step in that direction is enough. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to choose, daily, moment by moment, in small ways and large. Choose meaning over comfort, contribution over consumption, love over self-concern. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, you'll notice something shift. The emptiness won't disappear overnight, but it will loosen its grip. The anxiety won't vanish, but it will transform from enemy to guide. And you'll start to feel something you may have forgotten was possible, a quiet sense that your life matters, that you're necessary, that you're part of something larger than yourself. And that sense, that is peace. Not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of meaning. The knowledge that even when life is hard, it's not hollow. You're living for something, contributing to something, participating in something that will outlast you. And that is enough, more than enough. So take these practices not as rules, but as invitations, as doorways into a way of being that feels more alive, more real, more aligned. And remember, you don't have to wait until you feel ready. You don't have to wait until circumstances are perfect. You just have to start now, tonight, with whatever small choice is in front of you. And that choice, that is where everything begins. Chapter 15. Resting in meaning. The room is quiet now. Your body has settled. Your breath has slowed. And somewhere in the last hour and a half, something has shifted. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but quietly. You're understanding something you didn't understand before. About emptiness, about meaning, about what you're actually searching for when nothing seems to satisfy. And now, as we come to the end, there's one more thing to say. You don't have to figure this all out tonight. You don't have to wake up tomorrow with a perfect plan, a clear purpose, a complete transformation. You just have to remember what we've explored and let it work on you slowly, gently, in its own time, because meaning isn't something you force, it's something you allow, something you uncover through daily choices, small practices, quiet moments of alignment. So let's return to where we began, to that feeling of quiet emptiness, the sense that something is missing even when everything is fine. Now you know what that feeling is. It's not a defect, it's not a failure, it's not a sign that you're broken. It's a call, an invitation, a reminder that you were built for more than comfort. You were built to matter, to contribute, to be necessary. And when you answer that call, when you step toward meaning instead of running from emptiness, everything changes. Not because life becomes easier, but because it becomes coherent. It makes sense. It points somewhere. And that sense of direction, that is what you've been missing. Not happiness, not pleasure, not even peace, but direction, purpose, the knowledge that your life is moving towards something beyond your own temporary comfort. And once you have that, emptiness becomes impossible. Not because you filled the void with pleasure or achievement or distraction, but because you've stepped beyond the void entirely into a life that matters. So here's what I want you to remember as you drift into sleep. You are not empty. You are full of potential, full of capacity, full of the ability to love, contribute, and create meaning. The emptiness you feel isn't a sign that something is missing inside you. It's a sign that something is being asked of you. Something larger than comfort, something harder than pleasure, something more real than temporary satisfaction. And you don't have to know what that something is tonight. You just have to be willing to listen, to stay open, to notice where you're needed, and then to show up imperfectly, uncertainly, but with the willingness to be necessary, because that willingness, that is where everything begins. Let the next breath be slightly slower. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. And know this, you matter. Not because of what you've achieved, not because of what you've avoided, but because you're here, capable of choice, capable of love, capable of meaning, and That capability, that is sacred. So rest now, let go, let these ideas settle, and trust that when you wake tomorrow, something will have shifted. Not everything, but something. A small opening, a quiet willingness, a sense that maybe, just maybe, the life you've been living can become the life you're called to live. Not through some grand transformation, but through small, daily, moment-by-moment choices to matter, to contribute, to love. And those choices change everything. So sleep well, rest deeply, and know that the emptiness isn't your enemy, it's your guide, guiding you toward a life that matters, a life that's necessary, a life that's yours. And that life is waiting for you, not in some distant future, but in the next moment, the next choice, the next opportunity to be useful, present, and real. So rest in that. Rest in meaning. Rest in the knowledge that you're already everything you need to be. You just have to remember and choose and show up. And when you do, emptiness dissolves, meaning emerges, and life becomes what it was always meant to be. Not easy, not comfortable, not perfect, but real, necessary, yours. And that is enough. More than enough. That is everything